Hello and welcome to History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I am super excited to be joined by Aurélie Thiele, author of the novel The Paris Understudy. Aurélie, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Well, I want to start with the two main characters in this novel, Madeleine and Yvonne. It's 1938 Paris. If you could kind of just give us some of the context in which they find themselves.
So the novel starts right before World War II, and Yvonne is a student at the Conservatory of Music, and Madeleine is very famous, and she's judging the contest, and that's how they meet. They're both two opera singers in Paris in very difficult times.
Well, and as the story develops, can you tell us a little bit more about those difficult times and some of the decisions they're faced with?
Yes, so Yvonne got a late start in her career, and she agrees to becoming Madeleine's understudy at the Paris Opera. And she does not realize Madeleine just wants to keep her down because she has an amazing voice, but Yvonne doesn't realize this because she's more of an outsider. Then they are invited to go to the Bayreuth Festival in Germany in 1939 in the summer, so right before the war breaks out. Of course, I don't know the war is going to break out, but there are a lot of tensions, and Madeleine is invited, but doesn't want to go for many reasons, including the fact that she has a very close relationship to an Austrian Jewish tenor who escaped Austria when the country was annexed. And they end up going, and then they get there, and they realize it was a really, really bad idea. And when they see, up close, especially Madeleine, realize she should not stay. But what that means for Yvonne is that she's thrust into the limelight, and she has to fill in for Madeleine after Madeleine goes back to Paris without performing at the opera festival. I have to tell you and your listeners, the Bayreuth Festival was in Bavaria. It was a Nazi stronghold, and Adolf Hitler himself was attending just about every summer, which was not obvious to people coming from another country. And when they realize it, they are appalled, and they have to figure out what to do. And Madeleine gets to leave, but Yvonne doesn't have that kind of ability, and Yvonne gets stuck, and things go downhill for her.
Can you tell us a little bit about Germaine Lubin, the opera singer upon which you based Yvonne?
Yes, so about 10 or 15 years ago, I learned about Germaine Lubin, who was the most famous soprano of her time in Paris, and she was very well known for the roles she sang, especially in Richard Wagner's operas. And she's a little bit of a mix of Yvonne and Madeleine, and I just separated her traits into those two singers because she was very, very famous, but she was also physically similar to Yvonne, and she did sing in Bayreuth in 1939. And there's a lot of things in the book that are parallel to what she experienced. So, for instance, at the festival, there's a picture taken of Yvonne, and there is a picture of Germaine Lubin at a party with Nazis. And when I saw the picture, I was wondering, how does someone get themselves into such a situation? And that's how I started imagining Yvonne's character. And Germaine Lubin, however, was not a really good novel character because she never expressed any remorse for what she did, and she did not denounce anybody, but she did associate with the Nazis, and she had an affair with a German officer, and after the war, she was sent to prison for treason. And it took her a couple of years before she could come back to Paris, and her career never recovered. And she was very one note. I read their autobiography years ago, and at least in public, she never showed any remorse. And I did not like that about her. But so I wondered, how could I integrate something like this in a novel? Because it's been a very difficult period for the French, and being French, an American, I know this was very traumatic for the country, and I wanted to write something about the more complex choices people faced at that time.
I'm curious to know more about the opera. I've never been to an opera. I'm assuming you have, and maybe you enjoy opera. Why did you choose this setting, and what's the value here of putting light on the opera and how it was involved in some way or fashion in the decisions people made in this very difficult time?
Well, personally, I love opera. I think people singing without microphones into a full room really resonates, at a physical level, it really resonates with the spectators. And it's very moving and impressive. And I also felt it was the right medium for the story because there were a lot of German operas that were available at the time. And that was a good place to have the French and the Germans mingle during the occupation of Paris. Because you can't really imagine German officers being at the theater when they don't understand French, for instance. But especially because they have so many amazing German composers, you could imagine them at the opera, and then that would facilitate this interaction between the occupiers and the occupied.
And you do have, we've talked about Madeleine and Yvonne and the decisions they're faced with, but you have a cast of characters here that they have little acts of resistance. Can you talk about what your characters do to resist, and maybe what some of the real historical figures had to do to resist some of the wrongdoing and the treatment towards Jews?
Yes, I do have little acts of resistance. So Madeleine, for instance, gives money to the tanner who is a refugee in Paris after fleeing Austria, so he can go to the United States. However, it does not succeed, but she tries to do little things once she realizes how bad the situation is, including distributing leaflets, calling for resistance, which was inspired by a real life figure in the Resistance network in Paris. It was Musée de l'Homme resistance cell. And the people, when they got caught in real life, were either executed for the men, or for the women, they were sent to labor camps in Germany. So that was something that I used for Madeleine's character arc, where she started as a really spoiled, famous soprano diva, and she realizes there are more important things. And there are also small acts from Yvonne. Yvonne does try to get people close to her freed when they get caught in the Veldiv roundup in July 1942. And that ends up being also a tragic turn of event for her, because she can save her son, but she cannot save her piano teacher. And in real life, Germaine Lubin actually is rumored to have intervened to save her gardener when he was arrested. So I wanted it to be the small acts people can do on a daily basis, even if it's not amazing or impressive. Her son, Yvonne's son, does join the Free French, and so he does fight for freedom. But the people who are stuck in Paris did not have that many options. So I wanted to emphasize that even small acts of resistance are very important in the long run.
You talked about Germaine Lubin's memoir. What other research did you do? What other resources did you rely on? I'm assuming this is fairly well documented. And then where it wasn't documented, where did you kind of have to fill in the gaps?
I read a lot of books, biographies and memoirs of opera singers. There were a lot of resources online. So for instance, for the Paris Opera, there are many resources on their own website about what they did during the occupation. And in fact, the director of the opera house at the time, Jacques Rocher, did keep 3 Jewish musicians on the payroll after he was banned to do so. And he did so until the Verdi roundup. And it's very well documented on the website. And after the roundup, things became too dangerous, so he could not do that anymore. But that really surprised me because I had never expected people to do something like this. And I found out about it when I was doing my research online. A lot of research was also just listening to the music, listening to Germaine Lubin sing. I went to the Bayreuth Festival, so just walking those grounds. They have a real strong sense of history, so that was very moving. And then you just don't want to do too much research because at some point you could just do research forever. So I made sure I had the details right. For instance, in terms of newspapers in France, there's a lot of newspapers which stopped operating after World War II and were replaced by new newspapers that I'm familiar with, but so I had to be careful not to mention a newspaper that actually did not exist during World War II, because the stigma of collaboration during the occupation of Paris was so strong that those newspapers could not continue operating and are largely forgotten today. So that was some research I had to do to make sure I had the names right. And then most of the research was about the Bayreuth Festival and making sure I got little details right, like who was a general on the Germany side who won during World War I at the Battle of Verdun, like little things like this, just to get the names right. I felt it was important to have the right context.
You talked about listening to the music. You also talked about the unique experience of hearing opera. Was it difficult for you to convey that on the page for readers?
Yeah, it took me many years to get to this final book. It's so hard to write about music and sound because you don't want to be technical about, the fancy musical terms because it separates the reader from the experience. But short of putting them in the Paris Opera and having them listen to Tristan and Isolde, it's also hard to convey the same feeling. And so I had to constantly remind myself that the readers want the feelings, the connection to the feeling when you hear music, especially when you listen to that quality of opera singing, as opposed to giving a lot of technical terms like, look at me, I know those fancy names for, faster and slower and aria and all that. So it's tempting to show off your knowledge, but I had to pull myself back. So initially, I would still use those fancy words and then focus on the feeling in the revision process.
And what about the actual fiction itself? You are a university professor and have been in academia. Was it challenging for you to kind of harness the craft elements of fiction?
I like it. It uses different part of my brain. And I've been running this book for a long time, over 10 years now, maybe closer to 12. I don't like to admit it. And it was just really nice to use my brain a different way. But obviously, it was hard at times to make the switch when you focus on engineering, which is what I teach all day. And then you get home and you have a couple of hours and you have to switch on this different part of your brain. But once I decided I was going to see this book through, because I gave up a couple of times, it was easier to make the switch, like on the weekends, whenever I had some time, because it was a part of my brain that hadn't been depleted during the day, because I was using the other side of my brain to teach math and engineering. So it was difficult, but it was doable.
Can you talk a little more about your journey to publication and those moments where you didn't think it was going to happen, and perhaps those moments where you knew you were finally going to make it?
Yes, I love talking about how I finally made it. So I started writing this novel well over 10 years ago, and I was writing by myself. I wrote really fast, but at that time there were still a lot of differences with the current version of the book. So there were little details that made the novel not really connect to me. So for instance, Madeleine's husband was a very rich industry CEO as opposed to being a conductor. And I remember sending it out to some agents, and some requested the full manuscript, but no one felt compelled to get the book, to agent the book. And I set the book aside. I rewrote it, still did not generate any interest. I started taking classes online with UCL Extension School, the writers program there, which is excellent. And I started seeing what I had been doing wrong, but that also meant I had to rewrite a lot of those pages. Probably most pages, when you think about it. I think I still have the first scene when they're in the Conservatory of Music for the results. That's probably from maybe version 2 of the book. Let's say this is version 15, you know? And I have one scene when Madeleine and her husband give a party at their house during the occupation that is also similar to what I had first written, but everything else had to be rewritten. And, you know, having a full-time job and having this story that won't let go of you, but that no one else seems to be really interested in, caused some reflection, questioning, philosophical considerations late at night. And I really thought maybe I should put it in a drawer, because many people try to write one book and they need the experience to finally write another book that will sell and will find readers. But it would not let me go. Like, the story would just not let me go. And the longest I've abandoned the project was about a year. I'd say maybe 9 or 10 years ago, 8 years ago. And I thought, no, I'm going to finish it. Even if no one wants to read it, I'm going to make this book as good a book I can. And then the rest is out of my hands. And so I took more classes, I read more craft books, and I just rewrote so many things. And I finally got a good manuscript. And the fun thing is, when I was taking classes at the UCLA Extension School, their writers program, I did a master class where at the end of those 9 months of heavy writing, we got to have 20 pages considered by an agent. And I thought, why not? She'll just give me feedback on whether it's working or not. I was at a stage where I could use some encouragement, and she loved it. And she said, when it's finished, I'd love to see the full manuscript. And that was Betsy Amster, who became my agent. And later we submitted to editors, and we did one first round. And then we did more changes, and then we did another round, and we did more changes. And then there was the last round. And by that time, we had only 5 people on our list. And the other rounds, we had 15 people each. And we had close calls, but it just didn't work out. And my agent was saying, well, after this round, it's going to get a little more tricky because it's really on a case-by-case basis, looking at what other deals those editors have signed to see who is a good fit for this book. So we sent out to those 5 editors. Out of the 5, 2 were not in the business anymore. So there were 3. And out of 3, 2 did not reply, and 1 said, offer. And the fun thing, the reason I like saying these stories, when my agent sent the book out for this last round, this happened to be the 1-year anniversary of my mother's death, and my mother died very unexpectedly, and this was a very hard time in my life. And my agent had wanted me to do some changes, and she wanted to reread them before she sent it out. So I did not know exactly when she would send it out. So there was like this entire week where whenever she was done and approved it, she would send it. And then the 1-year anniversary of my mother's death, she sent me the email saying the book is out. And I was pretty convinced at that point that my mom somehow was going to make things work out. And she did. Thank you, Mom.
Oh, well, that's such a wonderful story of perseverance. Congratulations. How gratifying does it feel?
It feels very gratifying because I've been working on this for so long, and my mom was aware of me working on this project, and she always encouraged me. Sometimes it's bittersweet because she didn't get to see it, but I like to think she knew I wasn't going to give up. The book actually is dedicated to her, and I'm proud I did not give up, although sometimes it felt a little foolish not to give up. But it's a wonderful feeling, not only to write a book I'm proud of, but also to find other people like my agent, my editor, and other people who have been reading it so far who really love the book, because I really did not know if it would connect with readers.
Well, good for you. Are you ready to go on that journey again? Are you going to wait a little while? What's next for you?
Oh, I have more than one idea for the next book. So in those years where I had given up on this book, I started writing a new historical fiction book. I'd said at the very end of the Spanish Civil War in Madrid. And I'm getting close to the finish line for it. And that would be hopefully my next project. It's about this young school teacher who is also communist, and her husband gets arrested at the very end of the Spanish Civil War, and she has to figure out how to survive and try to save him and decide on their next moves. And I cannot tell you what the next moves are because you have to read the book for that. And also one thing I started doing after my mother passed away, I wanted to find a silver lining somehow so it wouldn't be so sad. So I enrolled in Bennington's low residency MFA program so that it would not take me 10 years to write the next book, you know? And what the low residency MFA model does is you go over there twice a year, about 10 days. And so I just came back from residency in Vermont last week. We have a June residency and a January one. And in between residencies, you write creative fiction pages, and you read a lot of books and analyze what works, what doesn't. And I'll be graduating in this January and this has really helped a lot my writing. So I really hope it does not take me 10 more years to write the next one, because I have so many ideas. I may have to live until I'm 200 years old otherwise, to write them all. So that would be my next plans, to finish this MFA and also to finish the next novel, and hopefully have this novel out within a year or two.
Well, I think you're definitely on the right track. You're building an audience, you're building your skills, you're building your networks. So, yeah, just all the credit in the world to you for going on that journey and continuing down that path. I think you're headed where you want to go.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been obsessed with becoming a writer since I was 5 years old. And the family legend, um, I was told by my parents that I started school at 5 years old instead of 6, which is very unusual in France, because I wanted to learn how to read and write. And I've been writing little stories, first in French and then in English after I moved to the States, since I was really little. So I'm one of those people who knew from a very young age what they wanted to do, but it still took some time to make it happen. But it was worth the adventure.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Aurélie, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. Congratulations on the Paris Understudy, and I can't wait to see what else you come out with.
Thank you very much. I'll make sure to stay in touch and see you
Great.
for my next book.
Okay.